Hello, everybody. Welcome to Med School Tutors webinar on making shelf studies count towards Step 2 CK. I'm going to introduce myself, and my co-host will introduce himself as we're waiting for you guys to filter in here, and then we'll kind of get into the activities. So my name is Joe Hansen. I'm a tutor working for Med School Tutors, and I've been working with the company for about 4 years. In that time frame, I've tutored somewhere around 250 individual students for over 5,000 hours on camera like this. So by this point, hopefully I know what I'm talking about when it comes to tutoring towards these exams. David, you want to tell them a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, my name's Dave Del Negro. I've been a tutor for several years, joining the med school tutor company a little over a year ago at this point. I'm an ER resident hanging out in the pretty good state of Pennsylvania, originally from the great state of New Jersey, and I'm very happy to be here.
And I'm coming from Southern California, so we're coming from all over the place
Hmm.
today. So let's go ahead and dive into our material on shelf exams and Step 2 CK. So to give you an idea of what this talk this evening will be about, we're going to talk about core clerkships, talking about what we need to do to prepare for each individual shelf exam, how to organize our study time and our resources, how we can translate that to Step 2 CK success, and then we'll try to answer your questions along the way. I do want to point out that I realize that everybody who will be attending tonight might be at various different places in their clinical curriculum, even if all of you are MS3s, although you don't have to be, you can be anywhere in your preparation to listen to us tonight. It might be that each of you are on different rotations and have already completed some of the rotations we'll be discussing. We'll try our best to make this as applicable as possible to everybody here. In addition to that, for those of you who are explicitly concerned about Step 2 CK preparation and or Step 2 CS preparation, we're going to include some content towards the end of our talk, specifically focusing on how to develop a study strategy and study schedule towards both of those exams. So we're going to do our best to give you guys a little bit of everything when it comes to these standardized exams this evening, but you can feel free to send us a question in the interface around us here, and we will try to answer it as we go, and any questions we're not able to answer during our discussion this evening, we will answer at the end during a live question and answer period. So go ahead and let those questions fly as we go. Just to kind of give you an idea of who Med School Tutors is, we are an online tutoring company that pairs tutors like David and myself with individual students to meet over the camera like this. We've been operating for over 13 years in this manner, and our roster of tutors includes medical students, residents, and even attendings with strong board scores to help you guys to cross the finish line on these exams. If you're interested in hearing more about what we do as individual tutors, we'll talk a bit about that at the end as well. I also want to point out that we will have a survey asking about our performance tonight, which a link should go out in the chat box that you guys can enter questions into around me somewhere on this interface. I'll remind you towards the end, if you could please provide some feedback to us about how we're doing. We'd love to hear whether there's anything we could improve about our conversation tonight. So without further ado, let's really get into the meat of the material here. So David, do you want to kind of tell us about maybe what the difference is between some of these rotations, which ones kind of matter more, which ones are a little bit more esoteric?
Yeah, and I mean, if we're talking strictly Step 2 CK, that you see that big, bold letters, I guess italicized technically, internal medicine. Not all of the different specialties are weighted the same. Internal medicine is a hefty lefty in this regard, and it makes up over 50% of the test material itself. And to compare and contrast that with your standalones, your OB-GYNs, your pediatrics, your psychs. And for those who are late second years, looking ahead, think very hard about trying to get these foundational ones early. Trying to get internal medicine first, because those are going to be the underpinnings of most of your Step 2 CK studying. And for the more standalone clerkships, these clerkships are heavy on individual details. That means the earlier you do them, the more time you'll have to spend redoing them when you actually study towards the exam itself. One way where this kind of merges is family medicine. Family medicine, you get a little bit of everything. And it's nice so in an ideal situation, you would have internal first. You would have surgery at some point after internal, because that's really hard to do in the other order. And then you'd finish up with something like family, so that it's almost a mini CK, because the family shelf has a lot of internal medicine. It has a lot of ambulatory medicine and everything that you can sort of think about in between. So at least that's one way to frame this for those of you who are still in the process of writing your clerkship schedules for next year.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add to that is that even though there are some of these standalone kind of rotations that are a little bit more esoteric, like OBGYN, where it's learning an entirely new language that you may have never seen before. This stuff all shows up on Step 2 CK. And so performance on each individual rotation is still going to kind of mechatron together to form one big test at the end of the year with Step 2 CK. None of these are really anything that we can ignore, even if some of them are going to be more integral to understanding like any other rotation, like internal medicine. So David, if you could tell us a little bit more about kind of like how electives might be scheduled and away rotations.
Yeah, so now we get to jump from for a lot of the late twos to some of the threes and soon to be fours. Some schools allow for elective time in third year. My school in Florida did. It gave us 2 blocks of 2 weeks, and that's a great time if you are interested in a specialty that's not heavily weighted in third year, like anesthesia, emergency medicine, some of the ophthalmology, stuff like that. There's your time to jump in, to really explore and see if you would like some of those things. Now, again, some of those are not heavily weighted on CK, but it'd be great for you to sort of figure out, is this something that I'm really in? If you like derm, do you really like derm, or is it do you like just the idea of derm, as an example?
Yeah, so like even though right now we're talking a lot about how to prepare best for these standardized exams, there's a temptation on the part of some students to take some of this elective time or vacation time they have during the third year just to buckle down and study. I might actually advertise against that. If you have a 2-week period that exists between now and like, let's say May, when your clinical rotations end, I think it would be really valuable for you to gain clinical experience and to seek out something that maybe you didn't know that you were interested in before and you want to investigate further now that you've got some clinical experience under your belt. It's better to use your electives as effectively as possible during the third year to learn about the rotations, more so than to use that time for like direct study if you were able to. I'd rather save that vacation time for later when we might have a more dedicated study period for Step 2 CK. It's worth pointing out that away rotations might eat into the Step 2 CK preparation time that you'll have over the summer. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Balancing the decision to take dedicated time for Step 2 CK versus doing away rotations that might be important for letters of recommendation is kind of difficult and specialty dependent, but we'll try to work our way through how to negotiate that as we get towards the end of our talk this evening. One thing that we really want to emphasize, though, is that while you're on your actual clerkships, it should be your goal to learn as much as possible about that clerkship and about what's on that shelf exam. Of course, you want to do well on that shelf exam, but that material is going to be on Step 2 CK. So even if for some reason you really don't like pediatrics, you got to know it a lot because it represents a healthy proportion of the material that's going to be on Step 2 CK. So David, how would you recommend to one of your students how you would best prepare them for a shelf exam while they're on rotation?
Yes, I mean, if you are getting ready for the shelf exam, so the best way to do it, and the way I tell my students, is to get your entire shelf schedule as soon as possible, because most rotations have softer spots and harder spots in them. And if you are doing surgery, perhaps overnights or 24s is not the time to do a lot of your hard studying. But perhaps there's an easier, like, for example, my surgery rotation had a week of ortho. And ortho was a relatively light week where you just watched people basically put knees back together for a couple hours a day. Find where your soft spots are, and then see and talk to other students who have taken that rotation and see the biggest question you could ask one, when did you study during surgery, during IM, during psych? And then try and write a plan that fits your schedule while at the same time allows you to breathe, because like this slide says, you don't have an unlimited amount of free time. When you get home from the hospital, you still have to study for the hospital, and you don't have time to read all the books and do all the flashcards. And we see here a question here: what are strategies that work for Step 1 that don't work for Step 2, and vice versa? So Step 1, you have a lot of time to learn, to repeat, to do PowerPoints, to do lecture material. You don't have that extra time in Step 2 studying and shelf studying. Your main objective should be cranking through UWorld questions. We'll get the resources in a hot second, but you don't wait to use UWorld typically in third year. You open it early and you use it often.
Absolutely. We'll talk, like you said, about resources more explicitly in a moment, but it is worth pointing out that you should crack open UWorld sooner rather than later. If anybody out there isn't using it regularly at this point, they're midway through their third year, now is as good a time as any to start. I'll point out that when I work with individual students towards shelf exams, I strongly recommend that they set aside at least a little bit of time each evening to study. Now, that's going to be really difficult on like a surgery rotation, for instance, where you might be called into the hospital for more than 12 hours per day. Maybe it's not realistic to get like an hour of study done each day there, but it should be feasible to do so on like an outpatient rotation like family medicine, where you hopefully are getting out around 5 p.m. each evening. So what I would suggest to make sure that we're getting the most out of each clerkship is that you distinctly set aside a certain amount of time each evening if possible, and set goals for yourself. For instance, getting 10 questions done per night in UWorld for internal medicine while you're on that rotation is usually a pretty good strategy to get your way through most of the questions that exist in UWorld for that. I'll point out UWorld has 1,300 questions for medicine, and while you might not want to finish all of them in like biostats, et cetera, or dermatology before the shelf exam, there's still like 900 to 1,000 really solid questions in there. 10 questions per night isn't even enough to get there. You'd have to use weekends, especially if you have a golden weekend, for a lot of studying as well. So map out ahead of time, like David was saying, how do I get through all of these questions? Like, how do I like make sure that I see everything I want to do? If I'm doing 500 surgery questions, I probably need to do 5 per day. And on my days off, get through like 40, 50, 60 questions even to make sure that we finish them. If you have a reasonable set of expectations beforehand, then you can make your way through the whole pizza without eating the whole thing on the day before the test, which is going to be impossible in some cases. So we'll talk more explicitly about how to prepare for each individual one, but the key takeaway here is that you should be consistently studying for every shelf exam while you're on that rotation, putting a little bit of effort in every day. And for days that you can't do that, that's fine. It happens. You might be in the hospital till 9 p.m. on a long call. That's a day where we're not going to study. But days where you're not in the hospital till 9 p.m., you should be meeting your daily requirements on there. I'll mention also, by the way, I apologize for looking like I'm distracted sometimes. David and I might be looking off to the side. While you guys are sending us questions, we're going to try to address them directly by typing back to you. So if it looks like I'm distracted a little bit, it usually is because I'm talking to one of your colleagues and answering one of their questions. So forgive me if it looks like I'm distracted every once in a while, or if David's looking away at like some of the questions you guys are sending in. If you guys do have questions, please type them to us. We're happy to try to answer them during our talk, and at the end, if we're not able to get to them while we're talking this evening. So as we kind of dive into the resources and materials that we'll be using for each individual specialty, to kind of give you guys a big overall view of the resources that are best to use here, the first recommendation is use UWorld. UWorld is the best resource. We should be using that consistently along with every single rotation. In addition to that, using a good video resource for each rotation is usually pretty helpful. I like to recommend that students use online med-ed. I find that to be the most economical and easy to use when it comes to something that you can listen to on your drive to the hospital every day or while you're cooking dinner or something along those lines. Usually each specialty has a few hours worth of material to listen to there. Pretty digestible overall. It's a nice source of passive learning to add in on top of everything else. But for each individual rotation, there's usually a set of resources that are going to be specifically better for this rotation than for others. For instance, Step Up to Medicine is a resource that really helps for internal medicine, but isn't so useful for other things. In addition, Case Files is a really nice set of material that you can use for like family medicine. And then if you have a core emergency medicine rotation with a shelf associated with it, it actually helps do the Case Files for internal medicine for that one. Blueprints is a great reading like resource for pediatrics and for neurology, but not necessarily for literally everything else. And surprisingly, psychiatry has a first aid text that's extremely good, even though we usually don't like many of the first aid texts for most of the other specialties, and we don't usually recommend them to students we work with. And finally, surgery has Pastana's surgery notes, which is super unique for surgery in the same way that Step Up to Medicine is useful for internal medicine. The point being that there's core resources for every specialty that are a little bit different than the others. We can't really get away with using just one resource for everything we're going to be seeing this year. In addition to that, there are going to be individual kind of like specialty tools of the trade for each of these specialties. For instance, physical skills like knot tying for surgery, or knowing that vital signs are different for pediatric patients versus adult patients, or knowing how to do the full neurological physical exam, which is going to be a hefty thing that you're going to have to do during a real neurology rotation. So when you're preparing for each of these actual rotations, you can kind of look ahead and see what kind of things that you need to know in order to perform best as a house officer, as well as to learn best to do well on the shelf exam. To that end, let's go ahead and like individually dive into each of these clerkships and talk about what resources are ideal for shelf exam and eventual Step 2 CK preparation. David, you want to kind of walk us through what you usually
Yeah.
recommend for internal medicine.
Internal medicine, the big granddaddy of them all. So we've already talked about UWorld and how great it is, and we're not just blowing smoke. It is that good. Um, Step up the medicine. People love it or they hate it. Count me in that latter of the group. I never particularly like stepped up medicine. I know it's helpful, and if it's helpful for you, by all means, run with it. But it was too listicle to me. We mentioned it in the slide later, but I was always a big fan of Kaplan lecture notes, which is basically the same thing as Step Up the Medicine, but in more of a conversational written style tone. But find one of those two and whichever one works better for you. Then online med ed as well. Online med ed, the videos and the notes especially are where a lot of your studying should go from. You should be online med ed notes, videos, the book of your choice, UWorld, rinse and repeat. And then a lot of people will use case files as part of their questions to do some cases together with the different topics. So are you a step up to medicine man?
Well, personally, not myself. So I did not find it to be super useful for me either. This is more of a do as I say, not as I do situation,
Yes.
though, because I find a lot of students actually do find it nice to kind of pop open and use from time to time, like while they're on the wards, for instance. And so they can sit down for like 15 minutes and get through some of that listicle style bullet point learning, which isn't super effective for me in particular, but might be helpful as just something to glance at. As far as a reference resource goes, though, it's very strong. It's very useful to kind of have on hand to glance at, especially if there's a topic where you're just missing every question in there and you just want to see that material laid out in front of you. So it's nice to have on hand for sure. In particular, I'm a really big fan of case files. I find that like sitting down for like 15 minutes and just doing a solid case on like congestive heart failure is really nice. It kind of like lays out everything that you want to know about that particular diagnosis. And internal medicine has some really tentpole diagnoses like CHF or obstructive lung disease or something like that, where you're going to get like a few questions on the shelf exam about those. And so having like individual like bread and butter cases laid out before you is really nice. Of course, though, I got to say like UWorld is it. Like this, it's what you got to do for this one, which is unfortunate because there are so many questions that we have in there. I'll point out, we didn't list this on here either, but there's always going to be another set of a couple hundred questions for every clerkship, since you can go to the NBME website and look at the Clinical Science Mastery Series on there. They usually have somewhere between 2 and 4 50-question practice assessments for each individual shelf exam. And they're pretty good at diagnosing like where you're at if you want to get a sense. And then they also ask very relevant questions to what might show up on the shelf exam. So it's very nice to be able to kind of put some practice in with some NBME provided questions as well. So even if you already have 900 to 1,000 internal medicine questions, that's another couple hundred to do too. So practice questions are really where it's at for IM. So it's nice to supplement with reading resources and all that, but you really have to get in your time with UWorld and get through those questions so you can set other things aside if you feel like reading all of Step Up to Medicine is a little bit too much of a task for you, and you can still do quite well on the shelf exam. Anything to add about IM before we move on, David?
No, I think you hit on a good point too, is that don't forget about these practice shelf exams. And when you're writing your study plan, you're almost writing everyone remembers writing their step one dedicated, and it's pretty much like writing mini step one dedicated. You should try and slide a practice exam somewhere in there to see how you're doing, and lots of UWorld, lots of review of your weaknesses. But other than that, it's knowing the way you put the puzzle together is the same as step one. It's just there's a couple different pieces and a couple different nuances for each different rotation and shelf.
Yeah, and they do a pretty good job of kind of like showing you some things that you might not have noticed as being relatively high yield in UWorld, or asking you some questions in a different context, which is always nice. So even from a learning perspective, it's a really strong resource to use those NBME practice tests. We got a question while we were talking, asking if online med ed videos are a waste of time or not. Honestly, no, I like them quite a bit. I would argue that there is one thing to mention, in that you might find, and a lot of students of mine find, that there's maybe about like 5%, 10% discrepancy between online med ed and UWorld. You might find that like they might recommend doing a low dose dexamethasone suppression test, whereas UWorld says do like the AM cortisol test or something like that. Like very fine gradations of like differences between them, but differences that could make the difference on a question that you're looking at. I would simply point out that online med ed is mostly right almost all of the time. And so it's a great resource to help to build your clinical knowledge. But if you were to run into any discrepancies, which is inevitable when you're looking at more than one resource for this material, I would lean towards UWorld as your gold standard in that regard. So I'll be willing to admit that there might be a couple of like discrepancies between some of these guys, and online med ed usually takes the brunt of that since it's one guy talking at you over the camera, so it's easy to kind of question that. It's still a really, really good resource, and I would strongly suggest everybody utilize it because it's so easy to integrate. Since it's a nice background listening resource and you can do it while doing something else if you really don't feel like you have the time to integrate it as like a full attention focused resource. To that end, we're going to suggest that you use online med ed for pretty much every rotation during your core year, just like we're going to recommend UWorld. So you're going to find our main resources here are going to be pretty consistent in regards to UWorld and online med ed. They form the basis for pretty much every shelf that you're going to end up taking. If you can do nothing but those two, you'll survive this year. Yeah. Because there's a lot of UWorld questions and there's quite a few hours of online med ed videos. But to kind of do that extra step and prepare yourself to be the best student you possibly can be, some supplemental resources would include, number one, Pestana surgery notes for surgery. This is a very small textbook that's very to the point. It's really nice because it basically just tells you the answers to UWorld questions in like bullet point. And while it's in bullet point like case files, there's very few bullet points. It's a nice compact book and it really gets down to the meat of the material really nicely. It also has a bunch of practice questions that covers its own material at the end of the book, but they're very short questions, straight to the point, so that you can go through them very rapidly in the span of like a couple of days if you wanted to. In addition to that, as far as like other resources that will be helpful on surgery, point out that case files is another okay resource for surgery. It's kind of nice to see like the classical case for appendicitis, for instance, written out in front of you. And case files does a great job of laying that out for you. The main texts that a lot of schools are recommending now are the surgery textbook by Dave Virgilio. I'd recommend to have that on hand as a reference resource, although it's a little bit much to ask students to read through that full thing. There's just simply not enough hours in the day. If you're going to be literally going to rotation every single day and then reviewing text afterwards, there's no time. Still, having it to glance at in case you get asked a question by your attending or you want to use that as a supplemental resource for something you're having a hard time with when you're actually reviewing UWorld questions, it's pretty nice to have. We've included AMBOSS on here because it's a nice secondary question bank. If you ever run out of UWorld questions and you want more questions from another resource, this is by no means necessary for the vast majority of rotations, but for surgery, sometimes that happened in the past. And so AMBOSS was our secondary question resource we'd suggest, in the same way that like many of you have probably used UWise for OBGYN, which we'll talk about soon. I'll point out though, this was a kind of a historical recommendation. It used to be that surgery only had about 120 questions in UWorld for Step 2 CK. So like you could knock that out in the course of a weekend if you really wanted to, and then have nothing left to do, at which point AMBOSS would provide a nice alternative. There's like 500 questions for surgery in UWorld now. They like really went to town adding new questions in the last like 9 months to 12 months in there. As a result, you probably don't need any extra practice questions. So don't take this as a recommendation to do millions and millions of questions. Instead, take it as a suggestion if you just want another resource that might be something you could use. And then finally, I'll point out, we've included surgical recall on here because you should have it on you during your surgery rotation because it tells you about all the PIMP questions that you could be asked in the hospital. The surgical recall is not a shelf exam book. It does not help you to do better on the shelf. There's no reason to read that book cover to cover or to use it as a resource that you'd be reading regularly. You should only really use it when you're about to go into a surgery and you need to know what you're going to be asked during that surgery. So don't make the mistake of trying to read that book. That would be very boring and inefficient if you did. Anything to add about like the surgery resources, David?
Oh man, that would make Step Up Medicine exciting to me.
Yeah, no kidding.
So one thing I want to point out before I forget it, because I had a thought that floated into my mind, is there are a couple algorithms that are worth knowing, because trauma is part of surgery. Trauma is just an algorithm for the most part. It's if this, then that, else that. So if a patient comes in with a stab wound to the stomach and it's penetrated the abdominal cavity and they're unstable, then go to OR, else go to CAT scan. And there's a couple other like that. So before I forget, ACLS is for internal medicine and emergency medicine. So it's worth just doing a little bit of reading about the common algorithms that are in UWorld and the Step 2 CK, like advanced cardiac life support, like the trauma algorithm, because once you understand them, they will give you free questions on UWorld. And then just another point, 'cause I know you mentioned AMBOSS. AMBOSS has really sort of stepped up their game in recent years, to the point where my school's academic advisor thought that they were better than UWorld for CK. Sacrilegious, right? But it is worth noting to the point that they have firmly established themselves in that top tier, away from Kaplan and RX and on them. So for those of you who are squeamish about using UWorld throughout the year, know that you have AMBOSS if you have a longer dedicated to theoretically use as well. Other things you mentioned, completely concur. DiVirgilio was great, very easy to read, actually useful, teaches you IM and surgery at the same time. So there are some very good resources out there. And for last note about for pestañas, as someone put in a question in the chat, it's not all encompassing. It's a great review book, but it's not all encompassing. So you can't just read pestañas and only pestañas. It's great to read in the beginning when you're drowning and have no idea what you're doing. And it's great reading at the very end when you need just some quick review and the questions are awesome. But pestañas should be a top supplement, but still a supplement to your surgery work.
Yeah, that's a great point about AMBOSS in particular. I'll agree that in my experience and work with the students, AMBOSS is definitely my number 2 question bank behind UWorld. I don't know if I'm ready to make the leap and claim that it's taken superiority over UWorld. I feel like I'm going to get gunned down by the secret UWorld squad for saying that. So AMBOSS is definitely number 2. I would point out, though, as a slight point of differentiation here, that I don't find it necessary for any students to use anything beyond UWorld as a question bank, assuming that you haven't gone through UWorld twice. So one major recommendation as an overarching thing that we'll suggest is that you should aim to finish every UWorld question before each shelf exam. Use your UWorld reset after your final rotation, and your goal, if possible, should be to get through UWorld a second full time before you go and take Step 2 CK. Now, already that is a very tall order, and sometimes students are not going to be capable of meeting that suggestion because of limited time constraints. However, it is really, really nice to be able to get through the full question bank twice, because that usually gives you your best ability to get a really strong score on the exam. If you were somehow able to finish UWorld twice and you still had more time and needed more preparation, AMBOSS becomes a nice alternative to see some novel material. That's a threshold that you never need to cross, however, and most students will not. Alternatively, students who struggle with Step 2 CK despite using UWorld and end up failing the exam and needing to retake it, sometimes AMBOSS is a really good resource to use in that case, but nobody's going to do that here, so we don't need to consider that alternative. So my point being, AMBOSS is great, it's out there, but in the sense, like USMLE RX or Kaplan or these other question banks that exist, we can't do everything. We got to choose what's best. And so I would strongly advocate that you stick with UWorld when it comes to question banks. AMBOSS is a nice second choice, though. David, do you want to walk us through the resources for peds?
Pediatrics. Oh man. So UWorld, of course, never goes away. Online med-ed is very helpful here. The CLIP cases, which are now the Aquifer cases, why they changed their name, nobody knows. These are actually, so my school assigned all the CLIP cases, and let me tell you, they were more like a click case, as in click through them and get them over with for me. But the pediatric ones are particularly helpful because there are a lot of pediatric things you just don't see every day. And there are a lot of pediatric things that if you haven't worked with kids previously, that you may not be familiar with. I have no kids. I have no little nieces or nephews for like maybe a couple more weeks. So for those of you who are like me, who have a low background in pediatrics, because all I've ever worked with for most of my life on the ambulance was adults, then CLIP cases are very nice because they introduce you to not only do they have questions, they're case-based, but they introduce you into the science of different parts of pediatrics. Why, when you mix formula wrong, you can get different deficiencies or malnutritions or other problems. Lead poisonings and stuff like that. So they can be very helpful supplements, especially if you find you're bad at a particular part of pediatrics. Because pediatrics, like Joe mentioned earlier, it's one of those ones that has its own language. And if you don't know how to speak the language, you can use these cases as a way to sort of learn how to speak it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one thing I point out here is that with peds in particular, because you're going to end up seeing some relatively unique conditions like congenital conditions that should never show up in adult medicine, pediatricians always get mad at me if I ever say that pediatrics is just medicine for little people, because it's not, apparently not. Because, I mean, you're going to run into like propionic acidemia or like maple syrup urine disease or something horrible like that, because those are not seen in adult medicine but could be seen in pediatric medicine. So for that reason, emphasizing a specific resource to kind of look at congenital disease using like blueprints, for instance, is really nice. Also, the aquifer cases in particular are gaining a lot of prominence. Probably want to choose between those, between case files and aquifer, since they cover more or less the same ground in terms of like contextual learning. I would point out that a lot of schools actually mandatorily require you to use aquifer cases. So if that's your school, then just use those. Don't plan to use like case files as well in that case. Other than that, I'll just point out that a lot of people actually do say that blueprints doesn't feel like it covers all the material that you want to see on the exam. In the same way that we said that Histanas isn't comprehensive, blueprints for pediatrics definitely is not either. So it's not quite the same quality or depth that you'd see with like Step Up to Medicine. So using that as a reference resource and maybe emphasizing congenital conditions or things that are unique to pediatrics with that one would be a good idea. Just point out that it's not the strongest resource out there. So I have to provide that warning to you. Since we are endorsing the use of that resource, it is a little bit weaker than some of the other reading resources we've suggested. Otherwise, David nailed it. Completely agree with everything he said there. On the same context, as far as OBGYN goes, same idea with regard to a whole novel language here. In particular, you're going to have to learn a whole bunch about like fetal heart rate and strips that involve tachometry and things like that. So this is a real rough one to start on as your first rotation, as I can attest to. It's very shocking to have to start an L&D. So hopefully if you're going into it later this year, then you've got some clinical context behind you and learning the new language won't be as difficult. I'll point out that, again, Blueprints is actually a really good resource for OBGYN. It does a better job than Blueprints for Pediatrics, so we suggest that as our kind of like primary reading text. But I would also point out that for students who especially struggle with this or like having a hard time understanding what they're talking about at all in clinic or on like the labor and delivery ward, the Beckman text is actually pretty good at providing very detailed information without going too crazy in terms of detail. It's probably too much to read all of that, which is why we're listing it as a supplemental resource in the course of the rotation, because it is usually a very busy rotation, but it's nice to have on hand. Once again, UWorld, Online MedEd, sine qua non, you got to use those in this case. One thing that we didn't write on here and that I probably should have put instead of AMBOSS is that a lot of schools will give you access to the UWise question bank, which is the proprietary question bank that ACOG, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, have put together. There's about 500 questions in there. Pretty good quality. I would actually recommend that you use that in addition to UWorld if possible during your rotation. Using both of them, though, means that the number of questions that you have to tackle during this typically 6-week rotation, depending on your school, is like 900 questions. So suddenly it becomes kind of unmanageable to do absolutely everything. UWorld is still the like kind of best resource we have available, but UWise is an excellent resource too. And so if you have it available to you, I would absolutely dive into it, even if you can't finish absolutely everything in there. Otherwise, Online MedEd is a pretty good resource for OBGYN in particular, because again, learning the language of this specialty is really helpful because it is so vastly different than what you're going to see in internal medicine in some contexts. Anything to add to that one, David?
No, and I mean, the APCO UWise questions are exactly the sort of thing I tell students. If their school offers them, they're great. And I mean, if you touch on a good point too, if you have only 6 weeks for it, my school bunched it with pediatrics and did the entire thing for 12 weeks. So, but if you only have the 6 weeks, you can't do everything. Focus your UWise questions on, because they're all topics. So if there's a particular topic you're bad at, do that 10-question quiz, or use it because at the very end there is 50-question practice tests for OB only, for GYN only, and then I believe there's a 100-question practice test for OBGYN. So even if you don't get a chance to use all of them because it's a compressed period of time, you can still use them as free practice tests if your school already bought it for you. Save yourself $20 from the NBME style practice tests and just use them because the explanations are very good and they come straight from the source where pretty much all the other questions are written from. So I highly recommend ACOG in this regard.
Cool. Excellent. All right. So finally, psychiatry, last but not least, what would you suggest to students when it comes to psychiatry prep?
Psychiatry is nice, in my opinion, because it's the closest from step 1 to step 2. The aims of the questions tend to change a little bit. In a step 1 psych question, they have all of dig fast, and it's not that hard to figure out. But you're going to have to actually count symptoms sometimes and count periods of time in these questions. So it's really just UWorld, and AMBOSS would be a great place to supplement, or another collection of questions would be a great place to supplement, because there's not a ton of new material in step 2 CK Psych. You have to know a little bit more about each of the individual SSRIs, half-lives, things like that, and a little bit more about each disease. But it's not learning a new language like we said with some of the other ones. The terms are often the same, and psych tends to be pretty intuitive. So heavy on questions, find lots of them, do lots of them, because the shelf exam itself tends to be the curve is rough. My curve was actually rounded down because again, it's not new material. They just have to write it in tricky ways. So find hard questions, do hard questions, rinse and repeat.
I agree. This one is really the most closely adhered to, like you said, step 1 material. And so you already have a good basis in psychiatry if you were able to do well in like learning your primary psych material for your kind of preclinical coursework stuff. That being said, I really do like case files. For psychiatry, personally, that was a big favorite of mine when I was preparing for the exam. I thought it did a really, really good job of just locking down, all right, here's generalized anxiety disorder. Here's, MDD. Here's bipolar 1. Here's bipolar 2. Here's what you use for it. So there's only a few distinct diagnoses that we can have here. Pharmacology becomes a major component for psychiatry. And so doing lots of practice questions can help you to identify when they're going to ask about olanzapine and checking BMI and things like that, just by seeing it in context. Memorizing it from a list isn't as useful. Questions are super practical. One thing I want to jump in and say really quick, we got a question from somebody asking to clarify. Before, when I said getting through UWorld 2 full times, I meant get through UWorld once for each shelf exam. And then at the end of the year, when you prepare for step 2 CK, then hit your UWorld reset and plan to do all of UWorld again, if possible, before walking into step 2 CK. Don't try to get through UWorld 2 full times for every shelf exam. That seems very difficult to do. That is a really hard recommendation to provide based on time limitations. The idea would be by the time you get to your last shelf exam, you'll be finishing the last unused UWorld question for the first time, and then you try to get through a second pass during your dedicated preparatory period for step 2 CK. All right, so we've talked about the core rotations and the resources that we'd be utilizing for each of these guys. Just to get down to the nitty gritty a little bit more in terms of UWorld, because we've been emphasizing so much that UWorld is the tool to use. It's really nice to download this as an app onto your phone or iPad. Personally, I had a little mini iPad that I carried everywhere with me in the hospital, which I was allowed to connect to our EMR, which was really nice. But then on top of that, I could do UWorld questions on it, when I had 15 minutes or 20 minutes here or there. The residents I was working with, they called me a nerd, but I did well on the shelf exam, so I got the last laugh on that one. But the idea is that if you're doing these, when you have downtime in the hospital, it becomes much more capable to finish everything that you want to. Stealing 15 or 20 minutes when you're waiting to be dismissed at the end of the day, or when you're totally prepared for pre-rounds, but you got nothing to do while you're just sitting there. As long as you aren't taking away from tasks that you should be doing, make sure you ask, is there anything else I can help with before you plop down and start doing questions. It's really nice to try to sneak these in here or there, especially for long calls where you're just waiting for a patient to show up. Getting some questions done in the hospital means you don't have to do them at home. So having this as an application on an iPad or a phone, I recognize it means that you're probably not going to be able to attend to these or take as many notes on them as you would otherwise want to in your pristine environment in the library or at your desktop at home. But getting through these at all is better than getting through some of them under perfect conditions. So the idea here is that like carrying this around with you in the hospital would be great if you could put it onto your smartphone or onto an iPad or something like that. Like I said a moment ago, finishing all of UWorld by the time you get to the end of your MS3 year should be the goal. And then finishing all of UWorld again before walking into Step 2 CK would be like the extra goal, the cherry on top that would make sure you do the best you can on the exam. Any other tips, David, in terms of like how best to utilize UWorld during the course of the MS3
No,
year?
and that's a very good sort of thought process, is to slide a few questions here and there when there's downtime, and to speak to like note. I always kept a little notebook in my backpack. Now, I'm a big writing note person over typing person. There's studies, blah, blah, blah. That's for a different day. But and I always kept a little notebook. And for some reason, if I had if I had a little time to do some UWorld questions, I would jump in and grab my notebook and write a sentence or two if I needed to review something later on. Um, and that was how I got around that sort of problem. Is, you're right, it's not a pristine condition or conditions, but if you're able to sort of take notes for yourself later, you can fill in whatever you need to do and still get a little bit out of it. So moving on to the second half of this is Anki/Anki Web. I was never a big fan of Memorang, but Anki, I was a big Anki person, and the Brosencephalon clinical deck was great. I used to always start every clerkship. I would try the weekend before to get through as much of those the whatever it was deck it was as possible. Now, obviously, you're not going to do all of IM in a weekend, but whatever your first week's lecture material was about, I would try and do all the cardio questions before, or if it was surgery, try and do as many, because those flashcards are the quick associations that you need to jump from the concept to applying the concept. So, and your ability to make connections quickly and confidently are really helpful with those flashcards. And then write individual flashcards as you go along. I always like to tell my students, if the answer to something is, well, because it makes a good flashcard. Like a lazy example is, why is the normal potassium level 3.5 to 5.5? Because it is. So, and that makes a good flashcard because there's no concept there. It's just, that's a number you need to memorize. And things like pediatrics and OBGYN, yikes, tons and tons of numbers to memorize. Thankfully, most of them I never need to see again. But when you do need them, they're great flashcards, and the clinical deck for Brosencephalon does a great job for it. And then individual things you don't know, they become great cards for you to learn, and you'll remember them come test time. And even in the clinic, when you're under pressure, you'll have it there available to you. Joe, what do you think about flashcards and the different ways that people use them?
Oh, once again, a do as I say, not as I do type thing. Flashcards are not my favorite in the world. And since there are so many UWorld questions to do for a lot of these rotations, I found that I never really had time for them during my clinical year. That being said, Anki has really, been utilized as a very effective tool for a lot of this stuff. So grabbing a pre-made deck for this stuff is always really nice. I don't know if I'd recommend to every student to individually prepare their own flashcards. Personally, as far as note taking goes, I share your view that writing down my notes is probably the more effective way for me to learn. And so just having a scratch paper on which to write like things for me to remember was really effective. So I like having like a blank sheet of paper that I just jot down graphs, diagrams, notes, and then just kind of like collect them into like a binder, or like, use a Mead notebook or something like that. But other students that I've worked with have had tremendous success creating their own flashcards with which to use through the use of Anki or something along those lines, or alternatively using pre-made decks. It really depends on how you learn. There is a place for flashcards here or note-taking in UWorld, but it really depends on if it's effective for you. And that's something that hopefully we're starting to develop a sense of now that we've made it through step 1 and we're moving on through shelf exams, and kind of like getting a good idea finally about like how we best prepare for standardized material. So short answer is use what works best for you. Some kind of note taking from UWorld though, whether on a blank sheet of paper or on a detailed like spreadsheet that you have on a computer, should be used in order to make sure that you collect your thoughts. There's been a couple questions about like using like Firecracker in particular. If it works for you, great, but it's not one of my favorite resources to utilize during the clinical year. It's previously or historically was a pretty strong tool to use for step one preparation. Along the same lines that first aid is a great tool for step one preparation, but first aid for step two CK is less useful throughout the course of the clinical year as step one was for the preclinical years. Firecracker is kind of a step one relic. And if you're forced to use it, or if it's recommended to be used by like your school or something, do what you got to do. But at the same time, it's probably not your favorite resource to use if you have your own free control of your free time. One more thing I want to mention too is that we've gotten a couple questions about family medicine preparation, since we didn't explicitly include like a major slide on that one, since some schools have an ambulatory rotation, some don't. I would point out for family medicine, I would usually recommend that AMBOSS be your primary question bank for that one, because UWorld does not do an excellent job of targeting family medicine material. It's hard to do outpatient only questions in UWorld. There's no tab for that. And so you're going to get a lot of inpatient material that's not going to be totally applicable to family medicine if you try to muddle through UWorld. So AMBOSS is a nice alternative to use for that rotation. In addition to that, the AAFP has a bunch of questions on their website if you sign up as a student through their websites. So if you go to the American Association of Family Physicians website, then you can go ahead and take a look at the questions they have there. They have like 1,000 practice questions that are kind of geared towards residents more than medical students. Nonetheless, really good as a resource to prepare for family medicine, but there's like 1,000 questions in that question bank. I will go ahead and send a link to the AFP questions in just a minute for you guys to take a glance at. Anything to add for the family med stuff, David?
No, I mean that's what I used. I used those family medicine questions, and I mean I was somewhat fortunate. My school had a longitudinal family medicine, so we did it all year long, a couple days a month, and I had gone through all of it. If you have a short spurt of family medicine, like most schools have, then you're right. AMBOSS would be like a good place to go for this. Or case files for family medicine would be a good place to go. And that's making a system that works with whatever your school sort of picks at too.
Yeah, that's actually a really cool way they organized your family medicine rotation.
Yeah,
They
that
just
was
had
nice.
us do it in 4 weeks, so there was no way I was getting through 1,000 questions that way. On that note, though, talking about family medicine in particular, case files was one of my favorite things to use for family medicine. I found, again, I've been kind of like saying the case files is nice for a couple rotations. Family medicine, internal medicine, and psych in particular are my favorite place to use these. But they exist for pretty much every rotation that you're going to go on, whether that's an elective rotation or a core rotation, since they have individual case files for like anesthesiology and cardiology. Well, you don't need to use those because you're not going to be tested on those fields. Like you don't have a shelf exam for those. But it is really good for a lot of the core rotations, and in particular, like I said, psych, IM, FM, strongly recommend that we utilize these, since you can kind of just sit down in like 15 minutes and like make your way through a case when you're waiting to present to an attending, or you have some extra time at lunch or something like that when you're in the clinic for family medicine. Really strong resource to use as a supplemental resource, especially if you feel like you're on track to finish all the practice questions that you want to complete. Other than that, any other resources that we haven't really mentioned yet that you tend to like to send your students towards, David?
Yeah, I mean, I was never a big case file person as much, but some places they do, like family medicine, they do a really good job because there's sort of a dearth of resources otherwise that are specific for them. They have some. Look at this. I didn't even know they had critical care, medical ethics, and professionalism. If you build it, it'll be there, I suppose. As far as other resources, we got a shout out, or at least a mention of in the comments about Master the Boards. Master the Boards is Kaplan's version of first aid. I preferred Master the Boards to first aid for CK. I thought it was a little bit easier to read with a higher, but that's just me. I like the way that Kaplan tends to conversationally write that books, as I mentioned earlier. On that same note, I also liked the way that the internal medicine Kaplan lecture notes sort of came out. It was an easier read to me than other things were. Other than that, there's not many other resources It's really finding a couple things. It's experimenting, finding a couple things that work for you, and then sticking with those things. So for the average student, best practice, you would start with online med ed. You would plus or minus flashcards where they may fit in your schedule, plus or minus the book that sort of fits with that topic, and then UWorld, and then into your new topic. So, and for those of you who have been third years now for 2/3 of the year now, you kind of know this, and you've probably settled into a good thing. For those of you who are beginning or looking forward towards rotations, again, use your upper years as your guide, and ask more than one of them. Don't just ask the guy who scored the 270, because they may have a pretty wild or weird way of doing it. Ask a cross section of people who were bad at something and now they're good at it. How did you fill in that weakness? Or someone who just loves OBGYN. So don't ask them what the best way to do it is, and then try and put together a plan that fits the way you learn as well.
Yeah, excellently said. I would add to that and say, as far as kind of like utilizing some of these resources, we can now kind of like transition into talking about Step 2 CK preparation in general. And I would state that, like you were mentioning there's going to be a bunch of different paths to success on Step 2 CK. There are different resources you can use, different study strategies you can employ, different durations for your study schedule, et cetera, et cetera. The point that we want to make here is that although there are thousands of paths to success on this exam, we're going to try to lay out what we would argue is the straightest and cleanest path to success. That doesn't mean it's the best path for you individually, and you should, number one, identify how you learn best. Number two, seek additional sources of input from people you trust as well. But we would argue that UWorld is the best resource for Step 2 CK preparation. And in the vein of what we had said before, using UWorld basically for the duration of your core clinical year, and then getting through it a full second time before going in and seeing the real exam is going to be important in order for you to get the best score you possibly can. I would also recommend a full review of all the online med ed videos. It's also a nice thing to do in addition to that. And generally speaking, I'm going to recommend that students kind of go through a systems-based review, meaning go through all the medicine questions in one go through all the OBGYN questions, go through all the surgery questions in one go. So then you can watch the videos along with those. And then you can also use some kind of supplementary resource along with that. Now, supplementary resources are going to be the most fraught here, because you're going to hear a bunch of things about the validity and kind of strength of each of these guys. Step 2 CK gets kind of a bad rap in terms of like not being any different than Step Up to Medicine, but it's still a pretty good review book. It does have some minor differences from Step Up to Medicine, in the same sense that First Aid for Step 2 CK also gets a bad rap. It's not nearly as strong as First Aid for Step 1. A lot of people find that Master the Boards is a little basic, and that if your goal is to pass the exam and you're struggling with that, Master the Boards is helpful. But if you're aiming to get a very strong score, you're aiming for an above average territory performance, maybe Master the Boards really isn't the best review book for you. So my suggestion would be maybe start lacing in some of the review texts that you use through the course of the year. Maybe do a little bit of Pistana reading to prepare for surgery. Maybe do a little bit of review of like first aid for some topics that you feel weak in, like infectious disease medicine or something like that. And then maybe use one of these resources as like your underlying like core resource, like Master the Boards or Step Up to Step 2 CK, where you go back to it from time to time for topics that you don't feel great about. But the way that I would suggest that you kind of like layer these resources is to kind of go through every specialty again, medicine, peds, OBGYN, do the questions, do the online med ed videos, and then maybe spend a little bit of time doing some reading for each of those things on a daily basis. Anything to add about like overall resources that you use during a dedicated preparatory period here, David?
Yeah, no, and I think the order is the same. I think we diverge a little bit in how we would use them. So at least how I recommend to my students, or my style, is when you go through online med ed the first time, you should be doing it all. You should be reading the notes, watching the videos, the whole circus and pony show. When you're doing your dedicated, I typically don't tell students to watch all the videos again. I tell them to watch the videos for the things that they don't understand or don't get, as more of a secondary resource. And if you wanted to do a full length review of a system, the notes tend to be more than enough and then jump right into questions and use the videos as you find weaknesses through the notes and through the questions. Otherwise, again, like you said, find a resource or two that helps. I was a big Rosencephalon fan because their pictures on the flashcards had Master the Board's charts in them. That was really nice. How the step one Rosencephalon had all first aid pictures in it. They have all the Master the Board fun. So that's a nice way to sort of have your cake and eat it too. So the way I sort of tell my students to write their plans, or how I write the plans with them, starting with a little bit of review of the online med-ed notes, a little bit of review of whatever flashcards, whatever weaknesses you have, and then questions, and then when you find your weaknesses, start going back up to those supplementary resources. When you find that you're just not good at a particular branch of surgery, to go to Pestanias, or to go to first aid for step 2 and whatnot. No.
Great, excellent. So as you can see, there's slight variations on the theme here in terms of like what one person might suggest versus what another person might suggest. Although the core throughput here is practice questions. We got to get through them. UWorld's the best one available. Got to get through that. If there's one thing you take away from this. As far as timing the Step 2 CK exam, usually the best time to take it would be as close to the conclusion of your core clerkships as possible, because the material for the exam is going to be freshest on your mind right after you finish everything. Granted, it will have been at least like 9 months or so since your first rotation, so some of it's going to be a little remote at that point. Everything's only going to degrade further as time goes on. Now, there are going to be impediments that prevent you from taking the exam literally right after you finish your core clinical year. You might have like mandatory rotations, or you might have some other things that you have to get done, like away rotations or something like that. But to the extent that you have control over it, as early in MS4 as possible would be ideal in order to get the best possible score on Step 2 CK. To that end, in terms of like the amount of time you would spend in a dedicated study period, David, do you want to kind of like walk us through like what the ideal dedicated study period might look like, or what a functional one might look like?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those where it's a little bit different than step 1, because like you said, there are rotations to do in 4th year. If you are doing a competitive or a specialty that requires mandatory aways, like I did emergency medicine, then you may not have this infinite amount of time. Or if you're a match who's early, like optho or a military match, you have to sort of weigh, where are you, where do I want to be, and how much time do I have to get there? Because as our fun little picture at the bottom says, traditionally it was thought to be 2 months for step 1, 2 weeks for step 2, number 2 pencil for step 3. And for some students who have consistent board scores in the 60s, 70s, 80s, they can get away with that. They can review the basics for a day each on each system, do a practice exam, and then go. Some may need more, a little bit more. They may need 4, 6, possibly even more weeks there. And if you are one of those people who needs more of an extended study period, then your Step 2 CK approach is going to start approaching what your Step 1 dedicated sort of looks like. Meaning you're going to have a little more time to review the material, a little more time to go through questions and review them, because you need a little bit more in terms of the depth and the breadth of material. What have you seen work well in the past, Joe, with your students?
I agree that like we can get done with the preparation we need to survive in 2 weeks in some cases, but I've always found that the 2 months, 2 weeks, number 2 pencil is always underestimated a little bit. I found that students preparing for step 1 usually do ideal if they start getting ahead of it, like preparing for step 1 during their clinical year, during their preclinical year. Also, for step 2, then I feel like 2 weeks is like bare minimum. Survivable, maybe, especially if somebody's been doing really well on the shelf exams all year. Definitely not ideal. I usually would say a 6-week dedicated study period would be kind of like great, the thing we should strive for. The problem that we run into there is that a lot of schools organize their MS4 blocks in 4-week periods. Mm-hmm. And so taking 2 full blocks off for Step 2 CK might not be feasible for a lot of students, in which case 4 weeks is kind of the functional unit of time. I'd say we can probably get a lot done during that time, even though we know we're not going to hit everything we want to. But if you could, 6 weeks would be the number that I would really strive for. And if it's impossible to do that, it might be worth using some of your final rotation to start reviewing older material. Now, that's not possible if your final rotation is surgery. So you have to know that ahead of time. But if your final rotation is psychiatry or family medicine, maybe you can start cramming through some older material in order to make sure that you have more opportunity to finish your questions and finish your secondary review before you get to your exam. In that vein, this is kind of a sample study schedule that I might put together for a student who has the very luxurious 2 full blocks off for 8 weeks. I would point out there's probably more time than anybody normally would have for Step 2 CK prep. However, you could trim some time out of this by taking out some review days or some rest days. The point that I want to make here, though, is that students can typically get through somewhere around 60 to 80 questions in UWorld per day. If we have about 3,000 questions in UWorld, it stands to reason that if we move pretty quickly, we can get through all of the material in about 6 weeks, or we can get through it leisurely in about 8 weeks, like I'm showing here. Now, the core recommendation that I point out that I have here is, number one, we have lots of practice tests available for Step 2 CK. There are 3 NBME CCSE practice assessments, and there are 2 UWorld self-assessments. If you have the time to do them, I would use them all. They're all great at helping to show you what's going to be on the real exam. And in particular, the UWorld self-assessments are novel UWorld questions that aren't in the question bank. That means that you have 320 new questions between those 2 practice assessments that you can learn from by reading their explanations, which is super valuable. What you might also notice about this is that I've laid it out based on medicine subcategories and then generally speaking, overall specialties like surgery, OBGYN, peds, etc. My recommendation here would be that you go through UWorld in at least specialty organization. So do surgery questions all at once, do pediatrics questions all together. I strongly recommend against doing mixed blocks during your dedicated study period for Step 2 CK, just because it does not help super especially to see one congestive heart failure question on Monday and then another one on Thursday. If you see 17 congestive heart failure questions in the span of 2 days, you're going to be tired of seeing the 55-year-old man with shortness of breath on exertion who has jugular venous distension. You're just going to be used to it at that point. It's just, oh, there's another heart failure question. And granted, some diagnoses are going to be more minuscule. We're not going to get 17 questions on every single diagnosis in the renal system, for instance. But seeing the 2 or 3 questions that they have a minimal change disease in a row is really useful, as opposed to just seeing them kind of disparately spread out. For that matter, that means that we can also kind of focus on individual subspecialties within medicine, since there's so many questions in medicine. And so that way we can do only pulmonary questions for medicine for a couple of days and see all of the ARDS questions in one go. I find that this is usually the most optimal way, both for strong and weak students, in order to do the best they can on the exam. So if you're the student that's aiming to pass the exam and you need to pull up your scores a little bit, this is best. If you're the student who crushed all your shelf exams, I would still argue this is the better way to go through your secondary pass. I would point out too, using weekends for mixed questions or straight up using practice assessments as a source of mixed questions allows you to get a sense of what it will look like when you're being bombarded by random things and give you kind of exam context appropriate learning. But overall, this is how I might orchestrate or start putting together a study schedule as a big picture idea as you're preparing for Step 2 CK. And then when you kind of get into the first week there, plan, okay, I'm going to do 80 questions of cardio on Monday, as well as these online med ed videos. I'm going to do 80 more questions on Tuesday, as well as these readings and step up to medicine. You can start micromanaging the schedule from there, but laying out what you expect to accomplish by using UWorld as a guide for how many questions you have to complete in there and how fast you can get through them can kind of give you a scope of what your overall schedule will look like. Anything to add to that, David, in terms of study schedule or strategy overall?
No, and I mean it's the nice thing is it's a proven science. These study schedules, the material's hard, but putting it together doesn't have to be. Do them by system. Find your weaknesses. Review your weaknesses as you find them. You use intermittent practice assessments in order to see where you're at and where you need to be, and then from there just keep running on the wheel, because it's almost, if you're coming to CK time, that means you are almost done. You can start seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. So Make sure to schedule sufficient rest. As I like to tell all my students in the beginning, don't write a study schedule assuming every day is going to have 100% efficiency. Assume every day is 70% efficiency. Some days will be great, some days won't. So, and then just keep in mind that again, life goes on. You need to sleep, you need to eat, you need to have fun. So just like all the wellness and mental health of step one, third year is the hardest year because it's a year of not knowing anything, starting to know something, and then immediately moving to something you don't know next. So keep in mind all of the good habits that hopefully you've been building throughout the years, and don't get lost in the bubble just because it's CK time.
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually a really good point, that when I help students to construct study schedules, I usually recommend that even in dedicated study, like even if you had several weeks where you had no other responsibilities and this was your full-time job, hitting around 10 to 12 hours of studying per day should be your absolute maximum.
Yeah.
12 hours even is asking a lot.
That's
10 hours
tough.
is a pretty good number. Yeah. So treat it like a full-time job, but not much more than that. And one of the assignments I would give to you every single day would be to leave the apartment, leave the library, go out and do something. Now, it's easy for me to recommend that in Southern California, like go outside and like go for a jog or something like that. But for people like, you know, in New York or Chicago or something like that, maybe, you know, go to like get some coffee with a friend, grab a meal, go to a movie, just binge Netflix for a couple hours, whatever. Your assignment would be do something social or something other than studying for at least a couple hours each day. Even if you study for 10 hours and you sleep for 8, which would be great, but I know not all of you are going to do that. You still have 6 hours to do other things during the course of the day. And, you know, eating meals and like doing like things that you need to do, like laundry, fine. You should plan to spend like 4 or 5 hours doing something else. And that recreation is actually part of your study schedule. If you don't do that, then we're going to start burning out. To me, burning out on this kind of exam or shelf exams, etc., is more about going a long period of time without any kind of recreation or relaxation, as opposed to the raw number of hours you're studying. It's the continuous hours you're studying without any kind of release whatsoever. If you plan daily time to do something else, like exercise or hang out with friends, or, you know, just, you know, do anything like read a book other than medicine material or go to a movie or something like that, it can really help to decompress and to prevent you from reaching the point where you feel fed up with all of this stuff. So it's actually one of your assignments to have a couple hours of like fun or recreation every single day. At least that's what I'd suggest. So moving forward here, just kind of talking about like how we can do best on step 2 CK. One thing I would strongly suggest is that you should take at least one practice test before you go into the real thing.
Yeah.
It's tempting to just say, oh, I've done great in UWorld, like I'm doing good. I point out that UWorld is not a diagnostic resource. It's not very good at being a diagnostic resource, at least. So like whether you're getting like 60, 70, or 80% of questions right in there, the statistics they have in terms of your performance relative to others is not very good data. The data is kind of like subject to all kinds of bias and errors. As a result of that, don't use UWorld to tell you how well you're doing. Use UWorld as a learning resource. Use the NBMEs and the UWorld self-assessments as a diagnostic resource, and take at least one to see where you're at, because you want to make sure that you've got a score that's firmly in the passing range before you walk in and take an attempt at step 2. If you are trying to do the best you possibly can, take all the practice assessments, do them on a weekly basis, try to get all of them done so you can learn as much as you can from them, in addition to charting your progress and seeing where you are, say, relative to your step 1 score. I'll point out that the general kind of just word of mouth expectation is that you get like somewhere within 10 points ahead of your step 1 score on step 2 CK. Honestly, most residency programs are just going to look at the two numbers and treat them equivalently. So it'd be great if you could beat your step 1 score, but if your step 1 score is already strong, don't tear your hair out over it. Like, don't overthink this. Like, just get another solid score. You don't have to like overshoot by a certain number or anything like that. One thing I point out too is that you should only think to reschedule your step 2 CK exam if you're concerned about failing the exam. If you feel like you're not going to get a passing score, or if you feel like you can potentially study more and do better, but you just haven't given yourself the time to do so, fine, but only do that if it's absolutely necessary. Otherwise, I would stick with the original schedule that you set for yourself, mainly because for the most part, moving it back means moving rotations and, you know, maybe even not even completing all the credits you need to in your MS4 year. So it's imperative that you don't delay other rotations, move things around for step 2 CK, because away rotations and just graduating are pretty big criteria too. There are some schools out there that recommend you don't take step 2 CK until like after applying for residency, those are generally schools that have you take step 1 after your MS3 year. If that doesn't apply to you, don't worry about it, but a lot of residency programs want to see step 2 CK scores. So if you're capable of taking step 2 CK and you think you'll do well enough on it, you should just take it. I would not suggest you defer it. At the very least, they want to see some step 2 CK score before they rank you. So like, even if you're not finishing it before, say, September, October, finishing it by like January, February becomes a very, very imperative goal. Anything to add about just like, when to take the exam or anything like that, David?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good point. And some people will tell you that if you have a good step 1 score, to just sit on taking CK and releasing it. And that's somewhat of an older strategy too, because CK is rising in importance, rising in relevance. As students do better and better, there's so many applicants now that programs need more ways to stratify applicants. So that whole sit on your step 1 score if it's good and don't even release step 2 or don't take step 2 until late tends to be somewhat of an older theory that may still work for some of the less competitive specialties, but as you move up the competitive ladder, they're going to want to see your CK score, A, to make sure it didn't drop, and C, so that they can help stratify you among dozens and hundreds, maybe even thousands of applicants. So, and it could be, and if you didn't do as well as you wanted to do on step 1, then you can use it to make up for your sins of step 1 past or whatever happened. I had one of my best friends in med school had to have back surgery right before step 1 and slid across the pass line. Now, sliding across the pass line is tough when you're from California and want to move back to California. But they showed like a 35-point increase on CK and washed away a lot of the sins from her step 1 score. And because it was a real story with a real problems, her step 2 CK score got her back to scripts in California. So a happy ending, I might end. So again, keep in mind that you should be talking with your advisors about all this, but don't sit on CK because someone told you that's a good idea. That's not current anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. One more thing that I want to throw in here while we have you guys is talking about Step 2 CS, just because it is another standardized exam that exists out there and we haven't talked about it too much this evening. Step 2 CS obviously is required to graduate for most schools, and usually you want to have a passing score before you are putting in your rank list, although you don't need to have this done by the time you apply to your residency programs. They generally don't care about it. In terms of timing the exam then, most students are going to take this between September and December of their MS4 year. The idea being they want to get their score back safely before they submit their rank lists. And there are distinct periods of time in which Step 2 CS is reported. It's reported in like couple month increments, which means that like once you get past December, it's going to be hard to get your score back before like February, for instance. So the last time that you can take the exam and be certain you'll get your score back in time will be towards the end of the calendar year. So people ask all the time, like, when we should take Step 2 CS. The answer is whenever you feel like you'll be ready to take it. In particular, it's worth pointing out, Step 2 CS is difficult to schedule. There's only a few, 5 different facilities where you can actually take Step 2 CS in the US because they have to have real people come in as standardized patients for this one. You're not just at a computer. As a result of that, the spots fill up very quickly, which means usually you have to plan ahead by 5 or 6 months in advance. So planning right now for the exam would mean that we're aiming for like August or so. Maybe a little bit earlier than that, but the idea is that this is the time where you should be preparing to schedule a August, September, October exam, surprisingly. Now, as a result of that, you might have to take Step 2 CS during a somewhat non-optimal time. You might be on an away rotation or an ICU rotation or something like that in the fall. Really, though, just find a date that works for you, hypothetically, and stick to it. In terms of preparing for this test, it really requires very minimal dedicated preparation time. So unlike Step 2 CK, where I'm saying, like, if you can take 6 weeks, take it. For Step 2 CS, probably like, maybe 6 days. But like the idea is that for this one, you really need less than like 12 to 20 hours of dedicated preparation, which is like 2 days of studying for Step 2 CK. What you do need, though, is practice with this one. So practicing with a colleague or having a rotation where you're interacting with patients and doing physical exams, like an outpatient rotation, is really useful. But really just getting through a few hours of practice is usually sufficient. So as a result of that, when to take this exam just depends on when you have the time to take it. Just try not to schedule it during a crucial rotation, and that's about it. But I would warn you that because it takes so long to prepare or like to schedule this test, because it's so impacted in terms of dates, maybe start thinking about scheduling it right now if you want to have it ready to go in like the fall of this year. There's no dedicated study period for this one. Instead, just focus on sticking with a few hours of study and like just put it wherever you can in your schedule. Not nearly as important preparation wise as Step 2 CK. To that end, there's really only one resource to use for Step 2 CS, and that's the first aid text for Step 2 CS. This is basically all you would ever need to do well on this test. It does a great job of laying out the exam and telling you what's going to be on there, like in terms of like, here's how the test aid goes at the first chapter, the introduction to the book. And it does an excellent job of walking through all of like the major diagnoses you would expect to see on the exam and what questions you would ask, what physical exams you would do, how to write the note afterwards. So without getting too deep into detail with what Step 2 CS is, plan it soon, plan to spend only a little bit of time preparing for it, and use first aid for Step 2 CS and use it with a colleague or a friend or somebody who can act as your standardized patient so you can practice the act of actually going through the history and physical exam with them. That's the ideal way to kind of get ready for this test. Anything to add about Step 2 CS, Dave?
Not really. I mean, CS is the worst. There's no way around it. It's the most expensive free lunch you'll have in med school. And med school itself is a very expensive free lunch. The only people who really fail CS are the ones who just don't take it serious for the most part. Now, granted, there are some people who are on the borderline who have trouble with the skills or have English language, but the only people who I've met who have had difficulty with it just didn't give it the time of day it deserved. Spend a little bit of time on it, review it. If you have a block or a rotation in your schedule that's like it, follow it. So I'm an ER resident, which meant I just did it right after one of my ER rotations because half of them are STEP or half of the ones are ER based. If you have family medicine, do it after family medicine. Internal medicine, same thing. So where you may get in trouble is so I had a friend who was doing ophthalmology and was doing it in like the back half of fourth year after like 6 or 7 aways in ophthalmology. They have a weird system. And so she hadn't like seen a organ that wasn't an eyeball for like almost a year at this point. Those people are going to need a couple days of review with a friend. But even then, it's just keep it simple, ask the question, have a rote memorized system so that you don't forget silly things. And then make sure you don't leave too early. I had a friend who failed, was one of the smartest people in class just because he left before the 5-minute warning a lot of times. So dumb stuff like that. CK is just a checkbox to get where you need to go. Just give it the time of day and make sure you do a couple days or a couple cases with a friend and you'll be fine.
Yeah, putting in some effort and some practice is what's going to be necessary to pass this one. This one's only pass-fail, by the way, too, so there's no score to worry about here. I'll point out that around 94-95% of first-time allopathic US takers for this exam pass it. It used to be a little bit higher than that, and they've kind of like made the bar a little bit higher for passing this exam recently to more or less justify its existence. So as a result, you might hear from your school that it's more serious than it used to be. It's just as serious as it always was, but the fail rate has increased just a tiny bit. So your school might tell you that you need to prepare for this more than usual. You should prepare for it, but it's not necessary to take weeks off of clinical rotations to prepare for this one. Taking a few hours in the evening for a couple weeks before the test is going to be more than enough to make sure that you cleanly pass this. That's more or less all for Step 2 CS. David, any kind of like motivating or closing advice for anybody that's still out there kind of a little because what we've told them so far?
Keep in mind that you guys have done every one of these. You've learned all this stuff in Step 1. You've written a dedicated plan and followed it for Step 1. You've done UWorld. The resources and the names may change and the numbers may be a little more difficult, but so when and the questions are certainly longer, but break them down in the same sort of, use the existing skills you have already and build on them. It's not as if you're doing a completely different thing. This is just another high stakes exam in a series of high stakes exams, from the MCAT to the course exams to the shelves to Step 2 CK. So find what worked for you. Go out and seek your resources. If you have a school advisor, ask them questions. If you have upperclassmen, ask them questions. Come to us, bring us the questions as well. So there are tried and true ways of passing these shelves and these exams. Keep it simple, keep it high yield, use those best practices, and then make it your own.
Absolutely. Great advice. We've been trying to answer all of your questions so far, like as you've been putting them in. We have a couple more minutes left here. So if you guys do have any questions that you haven't asked so far, or you'd like us to elaborate on anything you have already asked us, go ahead and shoot those questions to us now in the interface surrounding you here. And I'll kind of remind you here, this is the question interface that you can type into. Any last minute questions, go ahead and send them our way so we can try to answer them for you. In the meantime, while you're sending those in, just to kind of let you guys know what MST is and what we do. Med School Tutors is a tutoring company. We pair students with individual tutors like myself and David to kind of work through whatever content you are working on at the time. We will develop a study schedule for you, tell you what resources that you should be using in your independent study time, work with you through difficult concepts and individual tutor sessions over a webcam like this for 1 to 2 hours in duration, and then communicate and answer your questions over email in between those sessions as well. We work for basically every test in medical school. I've taught towards biochemistry all the way up through Step 2 CS, including shelf exams, Step 2 CK, Step 1. And sometimes it's really nice to have an individual tutor that can be there to kind of help you out and to work through some of the difficult concepts. If that's something that you think you might be interested in, please feel free to reach out. We're always here to kind of listen to you and kind of get a sense of who you are. Our contact information is listed down at the bottom of this slide here. And we have a little promo here. So if you mention this webinar, we can try to help you out a little bit with the cost of that. David, are there any questions in here that we haven't gotten to yet?
Just taking a look here. So we had one. We had Andrew asked if we could go back to the IM slide if you have a quick moment.
Oh,
just
yeah,
to
sure.
sort of
Let me just zoom
make
back
sure that
here
we could see here.
Our IM slide. And here we are.
There it is. So UWorld, Step Up the Med, Online Med Ed, case files. So
anything more specific that he had asked? Oh, no. Okay, I see.
Yeah.
So great. Cool. Any other questions you're seeing here that we haven't fully explicated yet?
Let's go back to the beginning.
Just a couple things that I've seen as we've gone through. A couple students were asking, expectations for Step 2 CK. How well are we going to do on the exam, given our performance on shelf exams and UWorld questions? I want to strongly emphasize, UWorld questions are not a great way to know exactly where you stand relative to your peers, because you're using those to learn the material. So when you go through them, if you miss them, you shouldn't look at that as something to castigate yourself for. You're doing those questions to learn. So just the same way that you wouldn't be mad at yourself for not prognosticating what was on the next page of a textbook, you shouldn't be mad at yourself for missing a question the first time you see it in UWorld. As long as you're learning from it, you can answer it well. When you see it again eventually, then you're doing the right thing and using UWorld appropriately. So I would encourage you not to pay too much attention to percentages in UWorld, despite the fact that they emblazon their front page with that and tell you like, this is like how well you're doing. It's not that great a resource in terms of like diagnosing you. Practice tests usually do a pretty good job. So using practice assessments for individual shelf exams and the NBMEs can tell you generally where your score lies. But generally speaking, your performance on Step 2 CK is going to be dependent, number one, on shelf exam performance to establish your base layer. And then number two, the duration and intensity of your dedicated study period, which is why I'd recommend a 6-week dedicated study period would be perfectly ideal, if sometimes unattainable. 4 weeks is serviceable. Depending on how long you have and how well you use that time, you can really amplify from your baseline, which is established with the shelf exams. That being said, if you're crushing the shelf exams, that should put you in a great spot to just go and take Step 2 CK very quickly.
We have a question here from Stella. How do you recommend jotting down missed UWorld questions or reviewing missed questions in general? And as we have a little visitor here, hi Kit, I will say that my method of doing it is that I like to review my questions by first saying, if I got it right, did I get it right because I knew it or because I had a lucky guess? If I got it wrong, did I get it wrong because I just can't read the question or because I don't know it? And if you put it this way, one that you got right that you didn't deserve, you should review the same way as something that you got wrong and didn't know. You should spend a couple seconds reading through each of the UWorld answer explanations and then the educational objective. And if you still don't get it, then that's the time to go back to your secondary resource. If you got it right and you know you got it right for the right reason, you don't need to spend a ton of time going through stuff like that. You should read the right answer and the principal distractor and then sort of the educational objective and move on. So find a way that works for you, but that's how I typically tell my students to try and triage their time because there's not enough time in the world to review every question for 5 minutes each.
I completely agree that we should learn as much as we can from the questions. In particular, reading the explanations thoroughly, including the incorrect answer choices in there, is my strongest advice. Even if we don't have the time or wherewithal to take notes, if we happen to be like crammed in a closet or something while we're waiting to be addressed during rounds or like pre-rounds or something like that, and taking notes isn't so easy like in a cluttered team room, getting through the questions and reading everything is crucial, and looking out the diagrams they have for you. If you have time to take notes or you have the space available to do so, excellent. Personally, I like writing down one key idea from questions that I miss in UWorld and construct something of a UWorld journal where for every question I miss, I have one thing I write down, just one bite-sized, less than a full sentence, so that when I finally get through the 900 questions in medicine, if I get more or less half of them right, I've got a few hundred bite-sized facts to review, which is already a tremendous amount. And so like doing any more than that is probably not sustainable if you actually want to review your notes afterwards. So keep in mind that brevity is going to be really important when it comes to note taking when you're going through thousands of questions at a time. David, I think we've pretty much covered all of the questions that students have asked of us. So I'll go ahead and say, do you have any last final words to say then as we close out tonight?
No, and just I think that was very good. And that's a good note to end on. Keep your notes short. Keep your notes short and simple. My old biochem professor used to say, "Brevity is the soul of wit. Do not convince me that you are witless." So.
Sounds more like a literature professor than a biochem professor, but okay, well, I'll take it. So thank you everybody for joining our webinar this evening. Please feel free to reach out to med school tutors via the communication, like through email, etc., phone, website below if there's anything that we can do for you. Otherwise, we wish you the best of luck on the remaining shelf exams that you have over the course of this year, and good luck studying for and killing Step 2 CK. Thanks again, everybody. Take care. Have a good night.